Years later, when interviewers asked David Bowie about the station-to-station period, his answer was always the same, and always unsettling. "I honestly don't remember making that album. I know I was there, I know I sang those songs, but I have no memory of the experience." This wasn't an exaggeration or artistic mystique, it was the literal truth. Between 1974 and 1976, Bowie's cocaine consumption had reached levels that would kill most people, and the drug had burned holes in his memory, leaving only fragments and shadows where experiences should have been. He existed in a state that wasn't quite life and wasn't quite death, surviving on milk, red peppers, and endless lines of white powder, his body weight dropping to 95 pounds, his mind splintering into paranoia and delusion. The man who recorded Station to Station wasn't really David Bowie anymore. He had become the Thin White Duke, a character so consuming and dangerous that it nearly destroyed the person behind it. Engineers who worked on those sessions would describe a ghost in the studio, a skeletal figure who could somehow produce vocal performances of stunning power despite looking like he might collapse at any moment. And Bowie himself, looking back from the safety of sobriety years later, would speak of that period as if it had happened to someone else, as if the Thin White Duke was a separate entity who had possessed his body and created art, while David Jones slowly died inside. If you want to discover the untold stories of music's darkest periods, subscribe to our channel now, because what happened to Bowie in Los Angeles would change him forever. David Bowie moved to Los Angeles in late 1974 at what seemed like the peak of his success. He had conquered Britain with Ziggy Stardust, reinvented himself through multiple personas, and established himself as one of the most innovative artists in rock music. The move to California was supposed to represent a new chapter, an opportunity to break into the American market more fully and collaborate with the best musicians and producers the industry had to offer. He rented a mansion in the hills, surrounded himself with the trappings of success, and prepared to create his next masterpiece. But Los Angeles in the mid-70s was a city built on cocaine and excess, where the music industry operated on a currency of white powder, and everyone from executives to studio musicians to backup singers maintained their energy through constant chemical enhancement. For someone with Bowie's addictive tendencies and his fascination with altered states of consciousness, it was the worst possible environment. Within months of arriving, Bowie's casual cocaine use had escalated into something far more serious. What had started as recreational experimentation, the kind of drug use that was normalized in the rock world of the 70s, became a dependency that consumed his entire existence. He began measuring time not by days or hours, but by the intervals between doses. His body adapted to the constant stimulation, requiring more and more of the drug to achieve the same effect, and the amounts he was consuming quickly reached dangerous levels. 3 grams per day became his baseline, a quantity that would hospitalize or kill most people, but which Bowie had somehow learned to function through. The physical effects were immediately visible. His already thin frame began to waste away, his cheekbones becoming so prominent they looked like they might slice through his skin. His eyes developed a hollow, haunted quality, and his skin took on a grayish pallor that makeup could no longer fully conceal. Friends who visited him during this period were shocked by his appearance, but Bowie seemed unaware or unconcerned about his physical deterioration. The house Bowie rented in the Los Angeles hills became a physical manifestation of his mental state, transforming from a luxurious residence into something closer to a tomb or a psychiatric ward. The first change was the mirrors. Bowie, who had built his career on visual presentation and theatrical transformation, suddenly couldn't bear to see his own reflection. He ordered every mirror in the house covered with black cloth or newspaper, explaining to his assistant that mirrors were portals through which malevolent entities could enter our dimension. This wasn't artistic whimsy or playful mysticism. Bowie genuinely believed he was being watched and threatened by supernatural forces, and the mirrors were the primary access points for these entities. When asked years later about this period, he would describe experiences of seeing figures in mirrors that weren't his reflection, of watching his own face transform into something demonic or alien, of feeling pulled toward the glass as if it might swallow him whole. The refrigerator became another symbol of his decline. His assistant, Corinne Schwab, who remained loyal to him throughout this nightmare period, would open the fridge each morning to find the same 3 items: gallons of milk, red bell peppers, and occasionally cocaine wrapped in plastic. This bizarre diet wasn't based on nutritional science or any coherent health philosophy. It was simply all that Bowie could force his body to accept. The cocaine had destroyed his appetite and made eating solid food feel impossible. The milk provided calories and didn't require chewing. The peppers, which he would sometimes eat raw, but more often left untouched, represented a half-hearted attempt to consume something resembling a vegetable. His weight dropped from a healthy 140 pounds to 95, and photographs from this period show a man who looks terminally ill, his clothes hanging off a frame that seems barely able to support itself. As Bowie's physical health deteriorated, his mental state spiraled into increasingly disturbing territory. He became obsessed with Aleister Crowley, the British occultist who had died in 1947, the same year Bowie was born. This coincidence, meaningless to a rational mind, took on cosmic significance in Bowie's cocaine paranoid thinking. He began to believe he was connected to Crowley through some mystical thread, that perhaps he was even a reincarnation or vessel for the occultist spirit. He spent thousands of dollars acquiring rare books on magic, ceremonial rituals, and occult philosophy, books that he would pore over for hours in his mansion, making notes and diagrams that made sense only to him. His conversations became filled with references to astral projection, demonic possession, and the thin veil between our world and darker dimensions. Friends and colleagues who had known him as clever and ironic began to realize he was speaking about these things with complete sincerity. The rituals he performed in his home were elaborate and disturbing. He drew pentagrams on the floor in different rooms using chalk or sometimes his own blood. He conducted ceremonies at specific times based on his reading of occult texts, attempting to summon or communicate with entities he believed could grant him power or protection. Whether these rituals produced any genuine supernatural experiences or were simply the hallucinations of a drug-addled mind became impossible to determine, because to Bowie there was no distinction. The entities he believed he was summoning felt absolutely real to him. He would describe conversations with demonic figures, negotiations with beings from other planes of existence, and the constant sense that his soul was in danger and needed protection through magical means. His assistant would sometimes hear him in the middle of the night, speaking to empty rooms in voices that didn't sound like his own, as if conducting both sides of a conversation with invisible participants. In late 1975, despite his catastrophic physical and mental condition, Bowie began recording what would become the Station to Station album. The sessions took place at Cherokee Studios in Los Angeles, and everyone involved would later describe them as among the strangest and most unsettling experiences of their professional lives. Bowie would arrive at the studio looking like a corpse, his skeletal frame draped in the black and white clothes that would become the Thin White Duke's signature uniform. He moved slowly, as if conserving energy, and would sometimes need to sit for long periods between takes, gathering the strength to sing. But when the recording light came on, something extraordinary would happen. His voice, which should have been weak given his physical state, would emerge with power and clarity, hitting notes and sustaining phrases that seemed impossible for someone so depleted. The performances were technically perfect, but emotionally strange, delivered with a cold precision that felt more mechanical than human. Producer Harry Maslin watched this process with growing concern and fascination. Bowie was clearly ill, clearly struggling, but he was also completely focused on the music in a way that suggested the album was the only thing keeping him alive. Between takes, Bowie would sometimes speak about the Duke as if he were a separate person, referring to the character in the third person and describing his motivations and worldview. The Duke, according to Bowie, was a hollow man, someone who performed emotions without feeling them, who spoke of love while remaining incapable of genuine connection. This wasn't just a performance persona like Ziggy Stardust had been. It was something darker and more troubling, a character that seemed to be consuming Bowie from the inside, using his body as a vessel, while the real person retreated further and further from the surface. The other musicians began to feel uncomfortable, unsure whether they were working with David Bowie or Wyong on station-to-station runs over 10 minutes, and represents both the peak of Bowie's artistic ambition and the depth of his psychological crisis. The track begins with the sound of a train, a relentless mechanical rhythm that suggests both movement and imprisonment, going somewhere but never arriving. Bowie's vocal performance shifts between crooning vulnerability and sharp, almost aggressive declarations, as if two different personalities are fighting for control of the same voice. The lyrics reference the Kabbalah, European Stations of the Cross, and the struggle between spiritual aspiration and physical degradation. When he sings about the European canon being here, it's unclear whether he's speaking about artistic tradition or invoking some kind of mystical protection. The song builds to a climactic shift, where the slow, meditative opening transforms into driving funk rock, as if the train has finally reached its destination, or perhaps crashed entirely. Recording this track required multiple sessions over several weeks because Bowie's energy levels were so unpredictable. Some days, he could nail complex vocal parts on the first take. Other days, he would need dozens of attempts to get through a single line, his concentration shattered by exhaustion or paranoia, or the come-down from whatever combination of substances was in his system. Maslin learned to work around these fluctuations, capturing the good moments when they came, and not pushing too hard when Bowie was clearly struggling. The final version of the track uses vocals recorded across multiple sessions, stitched together to create a performance that sounds cohesive but actually represents several different versions of Bowie in several different states of consciousness. This fragmentation, invisible to listeners, perfectly captured the fractured nature of his existence during this period. As the recording sessions continued, it became increasingly clear to those around Bowie that he was no longer playing a character, but being consumed by one. The Thin White Duke was originally conceived as another in Bowie's long line of personas, a cold, aristocratic figure who represented a certain kind of emotional detachment and fascist aesthetic. But something went wrong in the process of embodying this character. Perhaps it was the cocaine. Perhaps it was Bowie's genuine fascination with the darker aspects of human nature. Or perhaps it was simply that he had lost the ability to separate performance from reality. Whatever the cause, the Duke became real in a way that Ziggy never had. Bowie began to speak with the Duke's voice, even when not performing, adopting his mannerisms and worldview. He made statements in interviews that seemed to express admiration for authoritarian systems and strong leaders, comments that would later come back to haunt him and contribute to the Victoria Station scandal. The Duke's aesthetic was deliberately cold and fascistic, drawing on imagery from German expressionist cinema and the clean lines of totalitarian design. Bowie dressed in stark black and white, slicked his hair back, and adopted a gestural style that sometimes looked uncomfortably close to Nazi salutes, though at the time this was interpreted as artistic provocation rather than genuine sympathy. But those who spent time with him during this period began to wonder how much was performance, and how much was Bowie's actual thinking being warped by cocaine paranoia and occult obsession. He would make statements about the need for Britain to have a fascist leader, about the weakness of democracy, about the appeal of control and order. These weren't delivered as obvious satire or artistic commentary, but as serious political opinions, and they reflected a mind that was no longer able to distinguish between exploring dark ideas artistically and actually embracing them. By early 1976, Bowie's body was beginning to fail in ways that even he couldn't ignore. His weight had stabilized at 95 pounds, only because it couldn't drop much lower without organ failure. His heart was showing signs of stress from the constant stimulation of cocaine. His liver was struggling to process the toxins flooding his system. He experienced chest pains, shortness of breath, and moments when his heart would race so fast it felt like it might explode. His teeth were deteriorating from the drug use and lack of proper nutrition. His hair, which had always been one of his signature features, was thinning and losing its luster. And yet he continued, driven by a combination of addiction, artistic ambition, and the belief that the Duke required completion, that the album needed to be finished no matter what it cost him physically. His assistant Corinne Schwab became increasingly desperate, trying to convince him to eat real food, to see a doctor, to take even a day away from the drugs in the studio. But Bowie was beyond reasoning with. He had crossed a threshold where the addiction was no longer just psychological but physiological, where stopping meant facing withdrawal symptoms that could be as dangerous as continued use. He was trapped in a cycle that would either end with the album's completion or his death, and it wasn't clear which would come first. Friends who saw him during this period described a man who looked like he was already dying, moving through the world like a ghost, held together by willpower and chemicals and very little else. Some genuinely believed he wouldn't survive to see the album's release. Station to Station was released in January 1976 to immediate critical acclaim. Critics praised its artistic ambition, its fusion of funk and art rock, its complex lyrics and innovative production. It reached number 3 on the UK charts and number 5 in the United States, proving commercially successful as well as artistically significant. But Bowie himself could barely appreciate these successes. By the time the album came out, he was so deep in his addiction and paranoia that the external world felt increasingly unreal and unimportant. The Victoria Station incident in May, where a photograph made it appear he was giving a Nazi salute, became the breaking point that forced him to recognize he couldn't continue this way. The backlash was severe, and even in his compromised state, Bowie understood that he had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed without serious consequences. The decision to leave Los Angeles and move to Berlin came shortly after, driven by a combination of the scandal, his recognition that he was dying, and the intervention of friends who convinced him that change was necessary for survival. But even as he prepared to leave California, Bowie struggled to remember what he was leaving behind. The station-to-station sessions, the rituals in his mansion, the long nights in the studio, all of it had the quality of a fever dream, vivid but fragmentary, real but somehow distant. Years later, when he spoke about this period with the clarity of sobriety and time, he would describe it as the closest he came to not surviving his own fame, a period when the combination of drugs, occult obsession, and character possession nearly killed David Jones completely. The most disturbing aspect of Bowie's lost years wasn't what he could remember, but what he couldn't. In interviews throughout the 80s and 90s, he would consistently describe the station-to-station period as a black hole in his memory, a space where he knew events had occurred, but couldn't access them in any coherent way. He would see photographs of himself from that time and not recognize the person in the images. He would hear stories from engineers and musicians about things he had said or done in the studio, and have no recollection of those events. The cocaine had literally damaged his brain's ability to form and retain long-term memories during that period, creating a kind of chemically induced amnesia that was permanent and irreversible. This memory loss was particularly painful because it meant he had lost not just the bad experiences, but also the creative process that had produced one of his finest albums. He couldn't remember writing the lyrics to the title track or figuring out the arrangement for Golden Years. The artistic decisions that had gone into creating the album, decisions that critics and fans would analyze and praise for decades, were lost to him forever. In a sense, Station to Station was an album created by someone else, by the Thin White Duke, or by a cocaine-fueled version of Bowie, who was so different from his later self that they might as well have been different people. This created a strange relationship with the work, where Bowie could appreciate it as art, but couldn't connect to it personally, couldn't access the emotional and creative space from which it had emerged. Looking back on this period, the question that haunts both Bowie's biographers and his fans is how something so destructive could produce something so brilliant. Station to Station remains one of the most critically acclaimed albums of Bowie's career, influencing countless musicians and helping establish the sound that would dominate the post-punk and new wave movements of the late 70s and early 80s. The Thin White Duke, despite or perhaps because of his troubling associations, became one of Bowie's most iconic characters. And the artistic risks Bowie took during this period, pushing himself to explore dark and uncomfortable territory, resulted in work that had a power and intensity that safer, more controlled creativity might never have achieved. But this success came at a terrible price. Bowie nearly died. He damaged his body and mind in ways that took years to repair. He said and did things that haunted his reputation for the rest of his life. And he lost 2 years of his existence to a chemical void that left only fragments and shadows behind. In later interviews, when asked if the artistic achievements were worth the suffering, Bowie's answer was always clear. No. He believed he could have created equally powerful art without destroying himself in the process. The myth of the artist who needs drugs to create, he would say, is a lie that kills people. Whatever Station to Station represented artistically, it also represented a cautionary tale about the cost of losing yourself in pursuit of creative vision, about what happens when character and reality merge in dangerous ways, and about the thin line between genius and self-destruction